And welcome to another awesome Sunday. Oh God, it has been a wonderful weekend. Happy Mother's Day to all the beautiful mothers out there. We love you guys. I hope you've enjoyed your weekend. I hope you've enjoyed your day. Everybody's had time to spend with family and friends. It's just been a beautiful weekend, and the weather has been absolutely perfect. I am delighted to be back with you guys again this Sunday. Unfortunately, last Sunday, Brian was under the weather. No, he didn't have COVID, but he was a little under the weather, and we had to postpone last weekend. But we didn't let that stop us. We're right back with you again this Sunday. And like I said, happy Mother's Day to all the beautiful mothers, the grandmoms, the stepmoms, the foster moms, just moms in general, those that stand in the gap for moms. You know, we're just so grateful to have all of you. And I just want to say, hello, Deborah. I just want to say, I love each and every one of you. Brian and I wish nothing but the best for everyone. And again, happy Mother's Day. And I hope you all have enjoyed your weekend. And again, I want to give a shout out to all my nursing friends and all my friends in general that have supported me upon my new venture of Drink to Shrink. I am so grateful for those of you that believe in this like I do, that have a passion to want to get your lives better and to get your health and wellness back on track. You know, there's a lot going on in the world today, and as I said earlier, a lot of people that were affected by COVID and that ended up in the hospital with COVID and that ended up on ventilators with COVID was basically those that had comorbidities such as diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, and lung diseases. Those people were most impacted by COVID. It was because they had an underlying condition. And the doctors and I, we always talk and we said, well, she had diabetes. You know, it's like they're expecting the worst outcomes for those that have those comorbidities. So with my venture, I am hoping to get as many people as possible healthy, you know, to clean out, to detox your body, and to lower your A1Cs, to help lower your A1Cs, to help lower your blood pressures, because we have a task to take. We have to increase our water intake. I tell people every day, people say, well, I drink water all the time, and they're holding that little 2 bottles of water. But you need to drink at least 8 or more glasses of water a day. You need to increase your fiber in your diet, which is your vegetables and your fruits and your nuts and your beans. You need to do that for your overall health and wellness. So without going on any further, I just wanted to introduce that because I will be doing another Facebook Live on tomorrow about this new product, Drink to Shrink, that I am doing as well. So right now, I'm going to bring Brian to the forefront. He's going to break down the Biden's press conference that was done a week or so ago. And he's going to make it clear so that everyone can understand it. Okay? All right.
All right. Well, good evening, Facebook family. And we did miss you all last week. And I am feeling 100% better. So thank you guys for all those that kept me in your prayers. And as Janice said in her infomercial, she does an infomercial every 30 minutes, seems like. But the Drink to Shrink, I just want to promote that business venture. She's doing an awesome job of that, and she has got 100% of my support, and she's got me making drinks and everything else, guys. So continue to pray for me. But anyway,
Hey, Trey.
We are going to go ahead and get started. There are several things that I want to address as it relates to Biden's speech, but something else that popped up this week that we want to just kind of have a leisure conversation about as well is the comments that were made by our Vice President Also comments that were made by a couple of our senators, Senator Coburn, and then our president as well, stating that America is not a racist country. So we'll deal with a little bit of that as well. But some of the things that I want to break down, and hopefully we can, within our hour, give you some more insight as relates to the press conference that Biden held, his first congressional address for his 100 days. We're going to talk about that. And if you all have any questions, just shoot us a question. But I want to break down just a few categories. We'll deal with a few categories. One of the categories we want to talk about is the opioid crisis. Now, here's the irony of Biden addressing the opioid crisis. One of the ironies there is we know that he was a proponent of probably one of the largest crime bills ever presented in the U.S. history. That crime bill specifically targeted African-American men, African-American people, but men in general, as it relates to the marijuana crisis at that particular time. So there was an all-out onslaught to apprehend, to lock up, not to address the situation from a standpoint of trying to deal with it as a crisis. That was never done in that particular crime bill up under Bill Clinton. Like I said, that Joe Biden endorsed and signed on, and actually was one of the progenitors of the bill as well. So in saying that, there was nothing put in place to deal with the so-called crisis at that time, or I would call it an epidemic at that time, as it relates to putting something in place to help black men concerning the marijuana issues, whether it had been selling marijuana, whether it was using marijuana. There was nothing put in place to directly deal with the crack cocaine epidemic that was put into our neighborhoods. And you all know the history on that. When you go back to the Reagan administration, you see that there was a direct correlation between African Americans and the crack epidemic and the government. And we saw that there were agencies used by the United States government to infiltrate the poor African American ghettos with crack cocaine. That's no secret anymore. You can actually get that information via the Free Public Information Act. So you can look that up. So when we look at the irony of what Biden is addressing concerning the opioid crisis, he is approaching this on a totally different plane. He's literally done a 360 as it relates to dealing with the opioid crisis. Now, my reasoning behind that and my thinking as it relates to why he's doing that 360-degree pivot is because this drug is affecting a new voting base that is largely, I'm going to say, of the multiracial sector as opposed to the African American sector. Okay, so he has to deal with that. And what I'm saying, or what I'm proposing and want you all to think about, is that this particular initiative concerning the opioid crisis is put at the forefront because it is going to affect a voting base. Okay? So if you do not deal with this opioid crisis, you are decreasing the voting population, as it relates to future elections. Okay, so I'm saying everything that he presented in his 100-day address was all politically motivated, and it was politically biased toward a voting population that is being created in the United States to usurp the black vote. Now, that's number one. That's my opinion. When you look at the address and when you deal with some of the key factors in the address, you'll see that these factors point directly to the Democratic Party creating a platform that appeals to voters outside of the African American population. Why? Because the African American population is still the smallest population group in the United States, and because in the next, might as well say 10 years, the Hispanic, the multiracial, yes, the brown, what they're calling the brown group is going to be the dominant voting population. So everything that was presented in his address dealt with that particular sector from a politically biased agenda that would address those issues within the brown community, leaving out the black community. Now, the black community is always indirectly affected. Always indirectly affected. So hear what I'm saying. I'm not saying that the black community will not benefit from some of these things in some way. Okay. It's same concept with trickle-down economics. The black community is always affected indirectly. Okay, so we see that even with some of these things that he addresses, we will experience a trickle-down effect concerning all of these issues that he touched on. Okay, so now let's deal with the opioid crisis. And I just did a little bit of research. I went to DEA.gov, so we like to give the resources as it relates to, especially when you start throwing out stats and numbers, things of that nature. CDC.gov and Johns Hopkins University, okay, as it relates to the opioid crisis. So I'm going to ask you, can you explain to us the difference, Janice, between synthetic opioid and an opioid?
Yeah, you know, with the synthetic opioid, you have other chemicals put into that particular drug to enhance the effects of it. And that way, with that, people get a better, quote unquote, a better high. So what they say is a better high, but it's a cheap high. It's a cheaper high. And the effects that it causes in the long run is what is so devastating. How it affects different parts of the body, particularly how it affects the mind. When if you have just the opioid, in its purest form, that one is just, it is what it is. You know, people get on it. They're both very addicting, but the synthetic opioid is far more addicting than just the actual opioid itself.
Okay, so let's say and I'll add to your definition of that. So the opioid or the opiate that we're talking about basically comes from the poppy plant. And opioid is considered to be the natural,
it's the natural
form of the poppy plant.
Yes.
Okay, so it's considered to be nature produced.
Right.
Some of the things that are, or some of what we get from the poppy plant would be opium, would be morphine, and would be codeine.
Right.
Okay?
Yes.
So those are some of the natural, that's what nature produces from the poppy plant. So the synthetic opioid is when the molecules have been synthesized to act or to mimic
that particular
the
drug.
actual poppy plant and what it produces naturally.
Right.
Okay, so it is created to mimic the same or have the same effect on the brain or the psychological blocks as far as and whatever it needs to mimic.
Pain receptors.
Right, the pain receptors in the brain. Okay, so that's the difference between an actual opiate or opioid and a synthetic opioid. One is produced in a laboratory that's been synthesized, the molecules have been synthesized, and the other is naturally based.
Yes.
Okay, so now when we look at the opioid crisis and what he is proposing that and they're literally calling this a crisis. It is an epidemic now. Some of the figures that we want to look at is how does it affect each population in the United States and who are the greater of the populations that are being affected by this opioid crisis. Okay, so when we look at the opioid crisis, I want to give you the percentages as it relates to those that are users or those that are abusers of the opioid drugs, be it synthetic or be it natural. Okay. So we'll deal with that. So these stats that I'm going to give are from 2015 to 2017, family. All right, so from the ages of 18 to 24 years old, from the years of 2015 to 2017, and again, this is information from CDC.gov, DEA.gov, and Johns Hopkins. As far as the black population, from the ages of 18 to 24, 2.6% of the black population were opioid drug users or opioid drug abusers. Okay. Opioid drug users or opioid drug abusers, synthetic or natural. Okay. 2.6% between the ages of 18 and 24. Okay. Now, in the Caucasian community, in the white community, ages 25 through 34, 40.2% are opioid users or opioid abusers in the Caucasian white community. In the Hispanic community, ages 25 through 34, 1.4%. They're actually lower than the African American community. Okay, let me give my reason just from a standpoint of looking at the stats on why they are lower. They're lower right now because their population percentage as Hispanic or Latin Americans is lower when it comes to their total number of the population. Okay, so quite naturally they are going to have a lower percentage than the other groups. Now, African American men 18 to 24 only 2.6%. Ironically, I could not find the stats on African American, and not just men, but the whole group from the ages of 25 through 34. All right? So I started to look at Johns Hopkins and see if I could find out why aren't there any numbers being reported on the CDC or the DEA.gov for African American people that are between the ages of 25 through 34. When that is the highest peak as far as age range of as it relates to going to the doctor, making sure you get your annual checkup, things of that nature. So why would you think that wasn't reported, that number wasn't reported? Being in the medical field as long as do you see a lot of abusers within the African American community between the ages of 25. Now they gave us the ages of 18 through 24, 2.6, but no data from the ages of 25 through 34.
Well, they're working for one. They're not, I don't think, in my seeing, that's not the age group in African Americans that are really on those drugs.
Okay. So if you had to give a percentage, what would you say the percentage would be?
I would say about probably a little less than 1%.
Okay. I can agree with that. I mean, there were no stats there, so we really don't know. But if I had to guess, I would say that it's probably going to be the same or either less than what the Hispanics are. Mm-hmm. Okay, in that particular age category. Mm-hmm. Interestingly enough, the population group that is affected most between the ages of 25 and 34 is the European population. Yeah. Is the Caucasian community. Okay, so now let's move to the overdose death rate percentages from 2015, still the same year periods, to 2017. Okay, the overdose death rates of opioids, be it synthetic or natural, for the white community was 42%.
Wow.
Okay. For the black community was 6.2%. And for the Hispanic community, 6.7%. So actually a higher death rate in the Hispanic community than the African American community when it comes to overdosing on synthetic or non-synthetic natural opioids. Okay, so here we see the black community is still the lowest, okay, out of all the population groups that we, that makes up what I'm looking at is the dominant voting population, okay, that is actually increasing and that is no longer in the minority category as it relates to the vote. And remember I said that everything that Biden addresses in his speech is motivated and driven by the next 2 years, the next 4 years, the next 10 years. All of that has to do with voting. Okay? Anything that you deal with in politics, you cannot do anything without the vote. Even in the legislation, even in the legislature, any legislation that comes before the House has to be voted on. That's why it is so essential for the United States to actually create a census, because based off of population from state to state, what the Census Bureau is for is to determine how many votes can be cast in the legislature or the House. So when we understand politics, when they push you to fill out the census questionnaire, that is so that the states that have 2, 3, 4, or 5 senators or congressmen, they can actually have some seats added to the Senate.
Based off the census.
That's right, based off the census, which increases their voting power. Absolutely. Okay? So that's why voting is so essential as it relates to the formation of government that the United States operate under, in the concept of dealing with or being a government based on a capitalistic system. Okay? So no legislation can be passed without a majority vote in the House. Okay, so voting is very essential. On the state level, the Census Bureau counting the population, it adds seats to the Senate. So those seats now can become a majority. You could sway the vote from a Democrat to Republican vote based off of population. All right, so now we got to fight this crisis now because the majority of the voting population, which is still the Caucasian vote, so we have to admit, even though blacks go out in large numbers, or we have been turning out in large numbers, but see, the only time here is, and this is something that's very interesting, you have 70 to 75% of African Americans only vote during the presidential election.
Wow.
Okay, as opposed to the Senate race, which Georgia this time showed us that African Americans will go out when they are pushed to vote for Senate seats. But even then, there was only 35 to 40% of African Americans went out for the last Senate race that they just had with Warnock.
But even with that, they changed the vote. They went from Republican to Democrat.
Well, they went from Republican to Democrat as far as out, yes, but as far as the state, it's still Republican controlled. Okay. You understand what I'm saying? But what I'm saying is that the percentage as it relates to the African American getting out and voting is only high during a presidential election.
Oh yeah, definitely. Okay, I agree with that.
So this is about more than just a presidential election. This is about, like I said, the next 2 years, because you got 2022 that's coming up, which is next year. You got 2024, and then they're looking at a 10-year model.
Yes.
So the Democrats want to control, and you will hear Biden refer to that. They want to control the House for the next 10 years. Yes. You understand what I'm saying? So they're looking at the voting group. What is going to be the predominant voting group over the next 10 years? And whatever that dominant voting group is going to be, that's what we have to build our agenda around. That's what we have to set our agenda around. So when you look at his address, family, you have to look at it understanding that the politics behind it is not to address anything black. The politics behind it will address colored, and the brown population, and anything that affects that population will indirectly affect black people.
I gotcha.
What they consider the African American population. But they will not deal with anything directly as relates to the African American population. Even the crime bill that they are proposing, the George Floyd crime bill, which should be a hate crimes bill, but they will not do that because then you have to fall up under the terroristic laws of the UN, so they won't address it in that fashion. So what they're doing, even with the George Floyd Act, it still will affect the brown population more than the African American population. The George Floyd Act will essentially do nothing to protect black men from being terrorized and for hate crimes being exacted on the black population, be it men or women. What it will do is put caveats in place to deal with police brutality from a resource standpoint, which simply means that they have put in the bill measures that will affect police unions, which is the Fraternal Order of Police. Okay. When you talk about police unions, Fraternal Order of Police.
Yes.
And essentially take monies away from the police departments. So now, instead of taxpayers' money being paid to these families that experience hate crimes by police and that are terrorized and their loved ones are killed by police, because I have to remind you that our money pays for that brutality. You understand? Our tax dollars pays for that. Okay, so what the bill does is it takes that burden off of the tax dollars and shifts it toward the Fraternal Order of Police, okay, which is no more than a Ku Klux Klan organization itself that funds the police You understand? And it shifts that weight also back to the state. If it's a state of law enforcement, if it's a county law enforcement, if it's a city law enforcement, it shifts it back to them, and now that affects their overall budget. So when you're talking about part of the act is to defund the police. So when you talk about defunding the police, all that is simply saying is that they're reallocating, they want funds reallocated within the police department to address issues of training as it relates to the police officers.
Yes.
If police officers are charged with any type of hate crimes, then the police department will have to have funding put in place and set aside to deal with any lawsuits. So that is what the defunding the police is all about within the George Floyd Act. So now, let's get back to our opioid crisis here. But I just wanted to kind of point that out. We have to make sure that we understand when you deal with political science, it is a science. Okay? So it is a science behind why there are proposals as it relates to everything that he wants done concerning legislation. Okay? It is a science behind. How do we keep control of the House? How do we set forth our agenda? How do we accomplish our agenda that we have set in place as a Democratic Party for the next 10 years?
Wow.
Okay, so it is a science behind that. The way you do that is you rally a base. You have, even if you have to create a base, you create a base. Okay, then you fund that base. After you fund that base, you select those that you want to represent that base. You understand? Once you have all of that in place, then the voting power is in your control. You understand? So from the highest office all the way to the lowest person in the community. Okay. So now let's finish looking at the opioid crisis. All right. So let's look at the synthetic, or that's what we're looking at, or the natural as it relates to each population, and what is the overall usage in large metropolitan areas as opposed to medium metropolitan areas and rural areas. Okay, now watch this. This is going to get you here. Okay, in the large metropolitan areas, okay, as far as population, the Caucasians or the whites, as far as users or abusers, is 54.2%.
Wow.
So what would be a large metropolitan area?
Chicago.
Chicago.
New York.
New York.
California.
There you go. California. All right.
Texas.
Yeah. Okay. So 54.2% large metropolitan areas are white. Users or abusers of synthetic or natural opioids.
That's a little over half.
That's a little over half. But this is fixed to get you. Okay. Blacks, 70%. Users or abusers of opioids, synthetic or natural, in large metropolitan areas. 70% of blacks are addicted to some form of painkillers in large metropolitan areas.
Almost 3/4.
Why is that? It's the question we have to ask.
It's more available.
Not only that, you're in the medical field, so I want you to think. So it's more available, but we're looking at in the age group from 40 to 65.
Stress level.
Okay. All right. So
Stress plays a big part in it too.
okay. So now we're looking at, so the income level that is most affected, that makes up that 70%, is poverty. Most of them are in the low income bracket.
Definitely, I agree
Okay,
with that one. 100%.
so that's 70%. Out of the 70%, 62% are low income in the black community. So that tells me that it is that there are peel meal factories
Yes.
that are making money off of our low income
People.
areas. Okay, where majority of the Medicaid, Medicare, I guess,
Medicaid and no insurance, self-pays.
and no insurance, self-pays, that can go there and spend $40
And get them
and get that
a nice little supply.
right from the peel meals. So, very interesting. Okay, and there's a way, and I've been saying this, and I'm gonna keep saying this. What is happening right now is a form of African American annihilation.
Definitely.
Okay, I keep saying that. AAA. African American annihilation.
Yes.
Is being implemented.
Yes, it is.
By way of the government. I'm not asking people to believe it. All I'm telling you to do is look at the facts.
Look at the facts.
Now, this is something, when we look at the African American population decrease agenda that is going on right now. So, one reason that the diversity community is being put in place as it relates to replacing the African American community is because in the next 10 to 15 years, the United States will be majority multiracial. Okay, so what is being done is the African American population is being mixed to be part of the multiracial by way of the agenda of promoting biracial relationships. Now, if you are not heterosexual and choose not to be in a biracial relationship, then the propaganda machine and the agenda is to push you toward homosexuality or lesbianism.
Yes.
Where you cannot procreate after your own kind. Okay?
That's exactly right.
So if you are an African American, be it male or female, that can procreate, then you're being pushed to create a biracial family so that you will fit into the multiracial diversity community.
Yeah.
Okay. So what you're also going to see,
sense.
Absolutely, what you're going to see is that the designation of African American within the next 10 years will be removed from the census. And what will replace African American will be biracial. Okay. Now, that's my prediction. You can write it down. All right. Now, let's move on. Let's talk about the Hispanic community as far as the large metropolitan area, 56%.
That's a big number, too.
That's a big number as well.
Yeah.
But see, that falls back to the dynamic of the low-income bracket.
Yes, it does.
Okay?
Yes,
so
it does,
they're just a little bit higher than we are.
Yeah, not much.
Right.
Just a little.
All right. So still, when you take the overall population and you look at the greatest number that is affected, it's still going to fall back to the Europeans.
Right.
Okay.
Europeans.
Because the African American, that 70%, is only deals with the bottom half of our population.
Okay.
Is dealing with the low income of the population. The 54.2% in the white population is dealing with
the upper
overall. Okay.
And that's more the medium to high income.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Okay, so now let's look at the small metropolitan and rural areas. In the small metropolitan and rural areas for whites, 65.4%. Okay, are opioid users or abusers in the white community. So you're talking about your rural white towns, which there are many. Okay, all across the United States. 65.4%. This is where your meth labs are going to be located. Okay, so you see a high usage of opioids.
Like in this area, Elmore County.
Yeah, like in this area as well. All right, so in the black community, 67.4%.
That's a lot.
Okay, so that is also a concentration of low-income brackets, okay, in those small rural areas.
Yes, yes.
And then not only that, you have a lot of biracial mixing in these small rural areas where there are whites. Now, there are some small rural areas that are 95% African American. You don't have the mixing in there, just like there are in white small rural towns, which are 95% still Caucasian. Okay, in the Hispanic community, 47.9% that live in those small rural areas are opioid abusers or users. Okay, so I thought that was very interesting. Okay, so let's look at any questions on that before we move. Okay, so when we look at overall with the opioid crisis, the community that is the greatest that is affected greater than any other community is still your European community. But also falling into that category is your Hispanic community. We see the high numbers in the black community disproportionately based on income.
Yes,
okay?
Definitely.
So, income-driven type of crisis here. Now, the political agenda here is to take that out of the predominant low-income bracket as relates to the Hispanic community and the white community. It is to take that away. Like I said, the trickle-down effect happens, so blacks will be indirectly affected by that as well. So they're trying to curtail that. Why? Because within the next
5 to 10 years.
That's right. Your greater population is coming out of the biracial movement, out of the diversity, multiracial movement, which your Hispanics fall into that category, and your non-whites. That's where your greater population, so the concentration is to try to minimize the death rate there so that the numbers stay up. Okay, that's my assessment as relates to why there is such an emphasis on dealing with the opioid crisis. And like I said, the irony there is there was not an emphasis on dealing with the crack cocaine crisis in the ghettos, but the solution there was lock them up and throw away the key.
That's exactly right.
Okay, so for the opioid crisis, when you look at the legislation, there's part of the legislation deals with the mental state.
Yes.
Okay, so they've got counseling set up.
Yes, exactly.
It deals with being able to put them in some type of form of rehab. Okay, where they actually go and can be housed.
Yes.
To recover.
Yes.
None of that was done in the crack epidemic that was experienced in the black ghettos. And in some parts of the country, it's still reaping havoc in the black ghettos. Okay? No legislation put forth other than throw them in jail, lock them up. If they die on the streets, put them on the meat wagon, you know, take them to the incinerator, cremate them, do what that was the solution. Okay? But now that you got an epidemic, so-called crisis that is affecting the highest voting population, that is going to be pushing the button for Democrat or Republican. Within the next decade, there's an emphasis on that. Okay? So politics. Okay? Let's move on to the next category that I want to kind of deal with. You have to keep me timed here. All right, we may already be over. But anyway, the next category I want to deal with real briefly is the child tax credit. Okay? The child tax credit. Biden stated in his address that child poverty would be cut in half. Cut in half. Literally, he even made the statement that child poverty could be eliminated. All right. Just foolishness. Okay. All right. So I went to PolitiFact.com to check these numbers to make sure that he was being honest with us. Now let's talk about the child tax credit. What is the existing child tax credit? Right now is $2,000 for low income and middle income families. Okay. What is a low income family, Brian? A low income family, according to the United States government, US.gov, is a two-parent household with two children that make $28,000 a year or less. That is what they consider low income or poverty. Two-parent household with at least a minimum of two children. If you make $28,000 or less, you are considered to be poverty in the United States. Okay?
That's 4 people.
That's 4 people that makes, but there's got to be two-parent household. Okay? That's the kicker, two-parent household. There is no designation for one parent. Okay? So they do not count the young mother that's out there that has 2, 3 children and she only makes $18,000 a year. She is not counted in the numbers as it relates to being in poverty because there's no daddy in the home.
Wow.
Okay? So she can make $18,000 a year, have 4 babies, and she is not considered to be in poverty. Because the way that poverty is counted in the U.S. is based on a two-parent household, not based on a single-parent household. So you can have a mother that makes $6,000 a year and have 2 children, and she is not considered to be in poverty. Okay?
I don't know what
so
did.
now let's establish right there that this will not do anything as it relates to doing away with child poverty.
It will not.
It will not do a thing. Based off the way that the U.S. calculates poverty and based off of the way that they deal with poverty, if you're not a two-parent household with at least 2 children, you making less than $28,000 a year, you are not in poverty. Okay? That is the U.S. Okay? So, like I said, you can be a single-parent mother making $16,000 a year, you're not in poverty.
According to
U.S. Okay? .gov. Now, so the existing child tax credit is $2,000 for low-income or middle-income families. Okay? What does Biden's legislation propose in the Americans Family Plan Act? What it proposes is for 1 year to increase that $2,000 tax credit to $3,000
yes,
per child, or $3,600 for any children under the age of 6. $3,000 up to the age of 17.
Okay.
Okay? Let me say that again. It increases the child tax credit from $2,000 to $3,000, okay, for children that are 6 to 17, and $3,600 for children that are 5 years and below. That's simple terminology, simple way to put it. Okay? All right. How does this work? If the individual is making less than $75,000 a year, they are eligible. Okay? If an individual makes over $75,000 a year, they are not eligible for the new child tax credit plan. If they are a couple, if they're a two-parent household, If they make $150,000 a year, they are not eligible for a two-parent household. Doesn't matter how many children they have. Okay? Individuals, $75,000 a year, they're not eligible for the child tax credit. And $150,000 a year for a couple, they're not eligible. Okay? Okay. So now, what will happen is the IRS is responsible for the tabulation based on the child's age and the number of children that are in the home, and they will divvy out monthly payments that are very similar to how they did the stimulus payments.
Okay.
Okay? But the legislation has to pass. Now, think about this. This is only a one-year proposal. After 1 year, this goes away. This is not a concurrent thing. This is a one-time occurrence, not a concurrent, perpetual thing that will be forever. This is only for 1 year.
Wow.
Okay? Wow. This will do nothing to eliminate child poverty in the black community.
You sure won't.
Because a lot of our black women, as well as men, are still unemployed. They have not gotten their jobs or have not gone back to work due to the pandemic.
That's right.
Okay? So what this will do is pay some bills for them and put food on the table.
Yeah.
Okay? If the legislation passed, if the Republican Senate doesn't come back and say, no, we're going to slice it and we're not going to approve the $3,000 and $3,600 tax credit.
Oh, so they haven't approved that yet?
No, they haven't approved that yet. Okay? So we're still waiting. We're still playing the game. Hurry and wait.
So the year hasn't even taken effect yet?
Half a year is already gone. And then it will take at least 90 days after it's passed in order for it to go into effect. Okay, so you could be talking about the rest of this year before that is even put into effect. Okay, provided, there again, that the Senate passes the legislation. Now, what group of people will this affect the most? According to Political Fact in US.gov, the population that will be affected the most is the Hispanic and Latin American population. Okay? They also have another group listed, the multiracial group. So multiracial is white and Hispanic. Okay? Is what they're considering also part of that multiracial group. Biracial group is African American and white, or African American and Hispanic. Okay. So even with that, they're still designating. You understand? There's a way of classifying the blacks and who the blacks are with. So if we're mixing with you, if you with a Hispanic lady or man, whether you're an African American man or African American woman, that relationship is considered biracial. It is only multiracial if a white mixes with a Hispanic or an Asian or a Latin. Okay? That's the multiracial group. And guess what they are considered on the census?
What?
They are considered white on the census. Okay? So, and I'm going to give you this. I'm going to show you this. And this is very interesting. I know we're pressed for time, but let me give you this guy. What I did was, as it relates to the children tax credit, like I said, the Hispanic is going to be the beneficiary, the most beneficiary of this particular child out of poverty legislation. Okay? And like I said, the IRS would make the monthly installments for the families that were eligible. But here is the white as far as population numbers, okay? When you deal with the 1 year, the numbers that will be affected as far as the white percentages, cutting the child poverty in half, okay? In the white community, this particular legislation will cut child poverty in the white community from 13.4%, it is projected, to 6.6%, okay? In the black community, family, it will decrease child poverty, projected numbers, from 20.3% to 13.3%. So roughly 7% in the black community. In the Hispanic community, it will affect their child poverty rate. It will decrease it from 18.9% to 11.4%, which is roughly 7.5% decrease. Okay, here's the kick. Okay, white population, and when I say white, this is also included, okay, multiracial community is 60.70%. Right now in the U.S., the white population makes up 60.70%. Now, when you go to the US.gov, when you go to the U.S. Census Bureau, it has a caption under there that says included are the Hispanic whites that are mixed with the whites and the Asian numbers that fall into the white category. Okay, all right, so it's really interesting when you start looking at it. But the white population, now you know that there's no way white population makes up 60.70%.
No, it doesn't.
Okay, but when you add in the multiracial, it still puts them at the highest number in the U.S.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, blacks, 13.4%. Okay, always been the lowest number, even when after slavery, 4 million blacks, which were predominantly in the South, we outnumbered the white population at that time by over 15%. But we were still considered to be the minority. Okay, so black population, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, is 13.4%. Now, listen at this. We're 13.4%, and our child poverty is going to be cut from 20.3% to 13.3%. Think about that. We make up 13.4% of the population, and we're going to go from 20.3% child poverty to 13.3% under this Biden's plan.
That means none of us would be.
That means that the effect, what you could do is half that, so that it would affect roughly about 6%, 5 to 6% of our children. So that means that almost 70 to 80% of African American, what is considered to be African American or black children, are in poverty, family. Think about that. 70 to 80% of African American children are in poverty, and this will only touch about 5 to 6% as it relates to this legislation. Sad. Hispanics now have passed the African American population. They make up 18.5% of the U.S. population now. There's your voter base. Your voter base is that 60.70% white multiracial who's considered to be white population, and the 18.5% that is now Hispanic. Within 10 years, they're projecting that 18.5% will rise to almost 40%.
Wow.
African American will continue to decline. AAA, African American annihilation. Okay? So the agenda to continue to imprison our men and to promote within our community a pseudo-family by way of homosexuality and lesbianism, and those that are going to college, those that are semi-educated or have a skill or have a trade are being pushed to marrying someone other than their race. So they are being pushed to create the biracial family. I know y'all say Brian hops on that every time. I'm going to stay on it because I want you to see what's happening. Okay? The U.S. government, and I've got this book right here. I've been reading, I'm going to show you this book. It's American History in Black and White by David Barton. Now, David Barton is a white author. He talks about from 1865 to roughly 1868, when the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment was being written. He has an actual chapter in here that talks about the Democratic Party wanted to exterminate all the blacks. Okay? And did not want to allow blacks to participate in any part of the governmental process as it relates to voting. Okay, so we see even back then, voter suppression, terrorism started because of voting. The Ku Klux Klan basically was organized based on the political agenda surrounding voting. We need to understand that. Like I said, the political science behind it. The quickest way that they could do away with African Americans participating in the whole concept of government based on the United States was to exterminate them. So there was a plan devised in 1865 at the creation of the KKK to not only terrorize blacks, but to exterminate all blacks. Okay, so now that they cannot do it openly, in which that's all police brutality is, it is a form of exterminating blacks, okay, to decrease the population. That is what the whole police, and we know that police were formed after the passage of the Emancipation Proclamation to go and to, understand that the slave codes, to go and bring back slaves that were fleeing to the northern portions of the country, things of that nature. So we know the whole development, the whole organization of a police department was to promote the extermination of blacks. It was created as a terrorist, militarized organization to keep black people in check. That's what the police department was created for. So now, when we look at history, history has a way of repeating itself. Now we look at the agenda is more propagandized, okay? And the agenda now to exterminate, to continue to deal. The plan was, and also when you go back to this, prior to 1868, there was no such thing as technically organized prisons, okay? And as a matter of fact, there were no blacks in prison prior to this time. There was no organized prison. What there were mental institutions and rehab hospitals. And the majority of the occupants there were white people. There are several accounts that I read in the slave narrative where blacks were actually admitted to a institution for mental rehab. Very, very few. Okay, but these mental rehabs were called training organizations to reintroduce those who were criminals back into society. This is what prior to the emancipation, prior to 1314 and slaves being freed, this is what was in place. After slaves were freed in the emancipation proclamation, physically freed, then the prison system was put into legislation to bring slaves back, imprison them, so that they could use the labor, free labor. That's why when you look at the 13th Amendment, you hear me say this all the time, the 13th Amendment is no more than legalization of slavery by way of an institution and organization called the prison. Okay? So we see prisons put in place after this amendment, and it was put there so that they could have a place that was set aside for blacks to be housed and to be used as free labor. Okay? So we need to read Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, and it is a prison farm. The prison camps are no more than plantations that are used to continue to propagate free labor within that state. So when you go back and you look at places like Birmingham, Alabama, Birmingham, the Steel City was built on the backs of imprisoned African people coming out of slavery. All the railroads were laid by slaves that had been put in prison for walking on the wrong side of the street, put in prison for dropping their handkerchief on the sidewalk. So we see a mass incarceration from about 1869 up even until the Great Depression. They were still incarcerated, and you see a mass terrorism. So the extermination of blacks, the annihilation, AAA, African American annihilation, has been going on now for over 100 years. Okay? So, like I said, this whole get back, I know I got off subject there, but to get back to what this will do for our children, it will help us at a bare minimum. And it will probably affect those that are in the most impoverished areas in our community. Okay, the Asian community makes up 5.7% of the U.S. population. That's roughly 18.9 million Asians that are now in the United States. Okay, in the next 10 years, they are projected to also surpass the African American population, which is at 13.4%, and really hasn't moved within the last 10 years. Okay, so family, I'm just giving you something to think about. I also wanted to cover the jobs creation numbers. He said that there was 1.3 million jobs created in March. That was based off of the jobs rate dropping from 6.2% to 6%. Okay, where was those jobs added? Those jobs were added in leisure and hospitality. There were 331,000 jobs added. There were 2.9 million jobs in that same industry lost in 2020 between the months of March and April. So they are still 700,000 jobs shy in that industry. In the repair and maintenance industry, as well as the laundry industry, there were 44,000 jobs added. In local government, there were 31,000 jobs added. In social assistance, which is going to be your social worker jobs, counseling, rehab type jobs. Those really increased. Yeah, 23,000 jobs were added. Okay, because of people's mental state, both PTSD and all types of stuff. In the financial sector, there were 19,000 jobs added. But in the professional and business sector, there were 111,000 jobs lost. So if you were considered to be a professional white-collar business, you lost a job. In manufacturing, there were 18,000 jobs lost in March. And then in the courier industry, there were 77,000 jobs lost. So the 1.3 million jobs that were added last year in March 2020, from March 12th, 2020 to April the 12th of 2020, there were 1.3 million jobs lost. So here's the irony, family. There was 1.3 million jobs lost between March and April of last year pandemic. And now Biden comes and makes an address within his first 100 days between the months of March and April. There's 1.3 million jobs gained again. But when you look at the numbers, it's not so. What actually was added to the job market were jobs that are now reopening. There were no new jobs added. There were jobs that are coming back from the 1.3 million jobs that were lost last year in the pandemic.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was not factual. That was inflated numbers. Okay, I hate to say it, was just a bald-faced lie, like my mama used to say. So I'm just a bald-faced lie. Okay, so family, there you have it. I'm gonna stop right there. We'll continue to break this thing down. I want to talk about next week. Is America not a racist country? Okay, we had Kamala Harris, we had the president, Senator Coburn. They're saying that America is not a racist country, and some other senators
Senator Scott.
Senator Scott is saying that it's not a racist country. You've had some other senators come out saying the same thing now, that America is not a racist country. I want to debunk that myth. America is an ultra-racist country. It may not be as racist as it once was because we're now dealing with it, trying to deal with it from a systemic problem, but America has not changed. It was created as a racist country, and it is still a racist country, and that was a bald-faced lie by our vice president, who is multiracial.
Okay.
There you have it.
There you have it. Well, thank you, Facebook family, for joining us today. We appreciate you so much. And I want to say, again, happy Mother's Day. We love you guys, and we'll see you on next Sunday. Same time, same place, 6:30 p.m.
Peace and love, family.
Good night.